Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to what might be our eighth or ninth episode of the Gallic War that I am so happy to present to you. It has been an exciting journey so far, and we have arrived at the penultimate year, the year 52 AD. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for stopping by and listening to this reading of Julius Caesar's Gallic War. You can drop a like and subscribe if it suits you. We're trying to get about 3 a day. So if we can grab that goal, I'll be very happy. You can join us on Twitch as well, where we do the live readings on Wednesday nights. Japan time, 6 p.m. Japan time. That's where I live. It's been a long journey to get where we are in the Gallic War. We just came off last week the siege of Avaricum. And it was a grueling, brutal siege. The Romans were starving. There were severe rainstorms. At several points, the Gauls made sorties out and destroyed the Roman siege works. And not only that, but the Romans were encircled by Vercingetorix's army, who was working hard on cutting them off from any hope of resupply. However, during a particularly harsh storm, the Romans made it look like they were packing it in and not able to do a lot of work that day, and the Gauls, seeing this, also became quite lax on their defenses. Which was Caesar's plan, so when he noticed the Gauls were not out in force, he orders his men for a sudden charge on the walls of Avaricum, and the city was taken. The Gauls immediately retreated from the walls once the first Romans came over, and they tried to make a defensive line inside the city. However, the Romans simply just kept coming in and stood on the walls above them and threw their javelins and pylons down. And the starving Romans then proceeded to slaughter nearly the entire city. Those who ran trampled on each other, and hardly anyone was spared. And that's where we were last week when we finished, which was the first of 3 major events that we're going to be talking about of 52 BC. We're moving on to the second one today, which has a more dubious honor. The Siege of Avaricum, the Siege of Gergovia, and finally the Siege of Alesia are all famous for different reasons. Avaricum, of course, for its brutality and the severe conditions that both sides were subject to. And Gergovia is, I believe, more famous for really showing the difference between the level in skill between Julius Caesar and his legates that were not Titus Labienus. Remember, Labienus is Caesar's right-hand man in this conflict. He has, on multiple occasions, managed the entire army, especially during the winter months when Caesar is back in Italy handling his gubernatorial duties, because remember, he's not here as a general only. Caesar is proconsul, so he is acting as the governor of 3 provinces. So he has a lot of bureaucratic work to take care of that he's having to stuff into the off-season, as it may be called here. And during those months, it is Titus Labienus who leads the effort and coordinates the army. And he does a fantastic job. However, as we'll see, in today's reading, not all the legates are up to par with Caesar and Labienus. Now today also marks the beginning of our readings into the great Gallic betrayals. And you might say, but wait, we've read so many of those already. Yeah, that's true, but now they really begin to compound. And the threat of Vercingetorix and the other Gauls really begins to show itself in this last coalition. And so that is what we're going to be reading today. So just to remind everyone where we last left off, Vercingetorix, despite having lost the Battle of Avaricum, his renown and his level of respect was vastly increased because he had been perhaps the only one among his peers to say we should not attempt a defense of Avaricum. We should do a scorched earth strategy just like we're doing with all these other towns and just focus on depriving the Roman army of supplies and targets. And so when things didn't work out in Avaricum, people were much more keen to listen to Vercingetorix because he had been right. The other Gauls, especially the Bituriges, who were the tribe that who lived in Avaricum, were insistent that the city could not be breached. Remember, it only had the one path, the one causeway that led up to the city. The rest of the area surrounding Avaricum was all marshes and difficult terrain. The city could not be surrounded and sieged in a way you might be thinking of. So Vercingetorix has just finished giving a large speech to the army, and he tells the Gauls, "Fear not, this has been a setback, but the war is not over." And so, let us continue. We have just finished Vercingetorix's speech. Caesar says, "This speech found favor with the Gauls, above all because the setback he had suffered had not made Vercingetorix downhearted or caused him to go into hiding and keep out of everyone's sight. In addition, they thought he showed foresight and perspicacity, since he had advised first of burning, then the abandonment of Avaricum, even before anything had gone wrong. The result was that, although defeat diminishes the authority of other commanders, the prestige of Vercingetorix, by contrast, grew daily because of the setback he had suffered. At the same time, they began to be hopeful because of his assurance about making an alliance with the remaining peoples. Then, for the first time, the Gauls began to fortify their camp. Though unaccustomed to hard work, they were yet so alarmed as to believe they had to put up with whatever he ordered them to do. Vercingetorix was as good as his word. He spared no pains to try and win the remaining peoples onto his side, enticing them with gifts and promises. For this purpose, he selected men who were most appropriate, by reason of their skill in speaking or of their existing friendships, to be effective in winning them over. He had the men who escaped the storming of Avaricum armed and equipped. At the same time, he made up the strength of his diminished force by demanding from the states a set number of soldiers, stating the required number and the day by which they were to arrive in camp. Also, he gave orders for all archers, for Gaul has an enormous number of these, to be mustered and sent to him. By this means, he quickly made up the numbers lost at Avaricum. In the meantime, there came to him a certain Tutimatus. He was the son of Alavico, the king of the Nidiobrigus, whom our senate had pronounced a friend, and had brought a large cavalry force of his own, plus some mercenary horsemen hired in Aquitania. Caesar lingered several days in Avaricum. There he obtained in an abundant supply of corn and other necessities, and gave the army a chance to recover from the exertions and shortages it had suffered. Winter was almost over, and the very season demanded that he restart campaigning. So he decided to set out in pursuit of the enemy and see whether he could entice them from the marshes and forest or blockade them. At that moment, the leaders of the Aedui came to him as envoys to beg him to help their people in a time of dire necessity. They explained that affairs were in a perilous state. Although it was their long-established custom to appoint only one magistrate each year to hold regal power, 2 men were now holding office, and both of them claimed that they had been legally appointed. One of the 2 was Convictolatavis, an energetic and distinguished young man. The other was Cottus, a man of aristocratic birth with considerable influence and powerful connections. The brother of the latter, one Valetiacus, had held the supreme magistracy in the previous year. The entire nation was up in arms. The Senate was split, and so were the people, and each party had its dependent supporters. If the wrangling went on any longer, the 2 halves of the state would come to blows. They were relying, concluded the envoys, on Caesar's concern and influence to prevent this happening. Despite believing that it would be to his disadvantage to move away from the war and the enemy, Caesar was well aware that disputes of this kind often lead to serious setbacks. He was unwilling that a nation of substance, and one so closely allied to the Roman people, which he had always fostered and honored by every possible means, should be reduced to armed violence, and wanted to prevent the side with least confidence in its own strength asking Vercingetorix for reinforcements. He considered it crucial to avert such a turn of affairs. According to the laws of the Aedui, the supreme magistrate was not permitted to set foot outside Aeduan territory. To avoid appearing to violate their rules and laws in any way, Caesar decided to march to their land in person. He summoned the entire Senate and the 2 men on whom the dispute centered to meet him at Dessetia. Almost the entire people gathered there. Caesar was informed that a small number of men had been summoned to meet in secret at a place and time not sanctioned by law. One brother had declared the other elected, although the laws did not permit 2 men from a single family even to belong to the Senate, never mind being appointed as magistrates during their joint lifetime. So Caesar forced Cottus to give up office. He gave orders that Convictolatavis, who had been appointed by the priests according to the state custom when their succession of office had been broken, should hold power. This decree settled the dispute. Caesar urged the Aedui to forget their disputes and differences. Once all such matters were set aside, they could devote themselves to the campaign and look forward to receiving the rewards which they would earn from him once the conquest of Gaul was complete. He also told them to send all their cavalry and 10,000 infantry to him quickly, so that he could distribute them as protection for the corn supply. Then he divided his army in 2, and gave 4 legions to Labienus and to lead against the Senones and the Parisii, while he himself took 6 legions along the river Allier toward the town of Gergovia against the Arverni. He shared the cavalry out between them. On hearing of this move, Vercingetorix broke up all the bridges on the Allier and began to march along the opposite bank of the river. The 2 armies moved away from each other, pitching camp within sight of one another and almost exactly opposite. Vercingetorix posted scouts to stop the Romans building a bridge at any point and moving their force across. Caesar was in a very difficult situation, in danger of having his advance blocked by the river for most of the summer, for the Allier cannot usually be forded before the autumn. To circumvent this potential problem, he pitched camp in a wooden location facing one of the bridges, which Vercingetorix had torn down. The following day he remained there in hiding with the 2 legions, and sent the rest of the army on ahead with all the baggage as usual. Some of the cohorts spread out to make it look as if the number of legions remained the same. He ordered this force to advance as far as possible, and when he reckoned that according to the time of day they must all be in camp, he began to rebuild the bridge using existing piles, for the lower part of these remained intact. The work was soon complete. He took the legions across and chose a suitable place to camp, then called the rest of the army back to him. When Vercingetorix discovered this, he moved on ahead by forced marches, so as to avoid being compelled to engage against his will. It took 5 days' march for Caesar to reach Gergovia from this position, and on the 5th day, a minor cavalry engagement took place. He reconnoitered the city's position. It was located on a high plateau, and every access route presented problems, so that he had no hope of taking it by storm. Nor did he think it advisable to undertake a siege before the corn supply was secured. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix, who was camped nearby, had disposed the forces of each individual Gallic state around him at moderate intervals. By seizing control of all the high points on the ridge which gave a view on the town, they presented an intimidating appearance. Each day at dawn, he would order the leaders of the states which he had chosen to assist him in planning the campaign to meet with him, so it would be apparent if there was anything to report or arrange. He let scarcely a day go by without testing his men's courage and morale, and an engagement of cavalry and archers mingled together. Opposite the town there was a hill. At the foot of the plateau, strongly fortified and sheer on every side. If our men could take and hold this, it appeared that they would be able to cut off the enemy's main water supply and prevent them from foraging freely. But the hill was in control of an enemy garrison, albeit not a particularly strong one. In the dead of night, Caesar moved out of the camp and expelled the garrison before it could receive reinforcements from the town. After seizing control of this site, he posted 2 legions there. He had a double trench dug, 12 feet wide, from the main camp to the smaller one, so that even individuals could go to and fro in safety from a sudden enemy attack. While all this was going on at Gergovia, the Aeduan Convictolitavis, in whose favor we have explained Caesar awarded a magistracy, was bribed by the Arverni. He then opened negotiations with a number of youths. Chief among them were Lidovicus and his brothers, young men of distinguished family. He shared his bribe money with them and encouraged them to remember they were born free, born to command. The Aedui, said Convictolitavis, were the only people standing between Gaul and certain victory. The other Gallic peoples were only restrained by the example of loyalty set by the Aedui. And if they abandon it, the Romans would have no position to maintain in Gaul. It was true that Caesar had bestowed some degree of favor on him, but after all, he had done no more than maintain what was an obviously just claim. Why should it be the Aedui who must come to Caesar as an arbitrator over their rules and laws, rather than the Romans to the Aedui? Convictolitavis soon won over the young men, both with his speech and with his bribe. They declared that they would be the very first to support his strategy, and begin to look for a way of putting it into practice, for they were not certain that their people could be induced to start a war on impulse. They decided to send Lidovicus at the head of the 10,000 men being sent to Caesar for his campaign, while his brothers went on ahead to Caesar. They also decided a strategy for dealing with all other contingencies. Lidovicus took over the army. When he was about 27 miles from Gergovia, he suddenly called his soldiers together, and in tears said, "Where are we going, soldiers? All our cavalry, all our aristocracy are dead. 2 of our leading men, Eporidorix and Viridiomarus, have been executed without trial by the Romans on charge of treachery. Hear about it for yourselves from men who fled the actual slaughter. My brothers and all my kinsmen are dead, and grief prevents me from speaking of what happened. He had instructed some men in what he wanted them to say. They were now brought forward and explained the same facts as Litaviccus had declared to the assembled company already, namely that the Aeduan cavalry had been killed because it was alleged they had negotiated with the Arverni. They had themselves hidden among the throng of troops and fled in the midst of the slaughter. The Aedui all cried out and begged Litaviccus to decide what they should do. As if the matter were open to debate, indeed, he said, and it were not absolutely imperative that we make for Gergovia and form an alliance with the Arverni. Can we doubt that after committing this horrible crime, the Romans are already hurrying here to kill us? So, if we have any courage at all, let us avenge the deaths of those who have been so shamefully murdered, and put these brigands to death. Then Litaviccus pointed out the Roman citizens who were traveling with them, relying on his protection. He stole a large quantity of corn and supplies from them, tortured them cruelly, and had them executed. He sent messengers to all the Aedui to rouse them with the same lies about a slaughter of cavalry and leading men, and he urged them to avenge their wrongs in the same way as he himself had done. The Aeduan Eporedorix was a young man of aristocratic birth and considerable influence at home. With him was Vercingetorix, who was the same age and equally popular, but of lesser birth. For Diviciacus had recommended him to Caesar, and Caesar had raised him from a humble status to the highest rank. These two had come along with the cavalry at Caesar's specific request. There was a dispute going on between them about the leadership, and in the earlier conflict over the supreme magistracy, both had fought with all their might, one on Convicta Latavius' side, and the other on that of Cottus. Of the two, Eporedorix reported the matter to Caesar at about midnight, as soon as he heard of Litaviccus's plan. He begged Caesar not to let the Aedui defect from their friendship with the Roman people, because of the young men's misguided scheme. For this would be the outcome if so many thousands of men joined up with the enemy, since their kinsmen could not be indifferent to their safety, while the Aeduan people, as a whole, could not treat it lightly either. This news caused Caesar much anxiety, for he had always shown particular favor to the Aeduan people. Without an instant's hesitation, he led 4 legions, ready for action, and all his cavalry out of camp. At such a moment, when the whole outcome seemed to depend on haste, there was no time to make the camp smaller. He left his legate Gaius Fabius in command of the camp with 2 legions. When he gave orders for the arrest of Litaviccus's brothers, he discovered that they had fled to the enemy shortly before. Caesar advised his men not to be discouraged at such a critical time by the labor of a march, and such was their eagerness that he advanced 23 miles. When he caught sight of the Aeduan column, he sent his cavalry to delay and impede their march, forbidding them to kill anyone. Then he ordered Eporedorix and Vercingetorix, who Litaviccus's men had thought been put to death, to mingle with the horsemen and call upon their own side. As soon as they recognized the 2 men, and saw through Litaviccus's deceit, the Aedui began to hold out their hands and signal surrender, throwing away their weapons and pleading for their lives. Litaviccus fled to Gergovia with his dependents, for according to a Gallic custom, it is a crime for them to abandon their lord, however desperate the circumstances. Whew. So there's a lot to take in there. Where have we gone? Well, no green screen today. You can actually see it curled up behind me. This is kind of the interesting event that really sets off the siege of Gergovia. The city itself is on a plateau, as Caesar said, so it's not like he can storm it. Caesar mentions this. And not only that, now there has been a a usurpation of power in the state of the Aedui. Why is this important? Well, if we remember the state of affairs in Gaul going into this time, into 52 BC, Caesar has two, I would say, his two most staunchest allies are the Aedui, who are in, the Celtica, or they're in Gaul proper, and the Remi. And the Remi are the southernmost tribe of the Belgae. So they're a Belgic tribe. And the Remi haven't been mentioned here. They're further away, so it makes sense. The Aedui are kind of the main focus. But the Aedui really are the most powerful now. Didn't used to be that way. Remember, when Caesar first got to Gaul, it was flipped, because the Aedui had been defeated by the Sequani. Because what had happened, the Sequani had brought Ariovistus and the Germans across the Rhine, bribed them for help, defeated the Aedui, enslaved a lot of their dependents, so on and so forth. We've all heard this story here, if you've been keeping up with the streams. And at that time, Caesar was very close with the Aedui leader called Diviciacus. And they had a good relationship. But that the magistry of the Aedui, kind of like the consulship in Rome, it changes. So every year they have a new magistrate, as it is. And now somehow it's fallen on two different men. And you can see in the state of the Aedui, there's decidedly a pro-Roman faction, which makes sense because the Aedui have cultivated a strong relationship with the Romans for years. And not only that, the Aedui basically owe their current position in Gaul, the position of power they have that is not subject to the slavery of the Germans or the other Gauls, to Caesar. It's because Caesar came to their aid, because he fought both the Helvetii and then Ariovistus, and then held off the Belgae. There's three different events that happened where Caesar essentially secured the primacy of the Aedui in Gaul, or in Celtica, however you want to describe Central Gaul. However, as we can see, there's a second faction, right? There's a group of usurpers, essentially, who want to join with Vercingetorix and the Arverni. They say, well, Caesar hasn't really done that much for us, right? He's not really that good of a guy. So maybe we should just head over to Vercingetorix, right? He's our people. And so they hatch a plot. The Aedui warrior Ludovicus is his name. Of course, hatches a plot where he tells a lie to a huge horde of Gallic warriors and says, the Romans have come, they've killed all our cavalry, they've killed our senate. Here's some people who were there and they witnessed the event. And he brings up like trained speakers. He literally brings crisis actors in. And they're crying and they're like, this is what happened. Caesar came in and killed everybody. And of course the Gauls are eating this up, right? They're like, oh man, this is terrible. And when Caesar learns of this, of course, he has the people who were supposed to be killed go back to them and mingle around and be like, wait a minute, aren't you guys supposed to be dead? They're like, what are you talking about? So the Ludovicus and the others who had joined him in this plot are forced to flee, and they run over to Gergovia. So this was definitely a tinfoil hat moment. This was I would say, an F-tier attempt at usurping power in the Aedui and bringing them over to the side of the Arverni. But it's not over yet. Oh boy. Oh boy, it is not. So let us continue. All right. Caesar says, Caesar sent envoys to the Aeduan people to instruct them that as an act of generosity, he had preserved the lives of the men whom he was entitled, according to the rules of war, to put to death. He gave over 3 hours of the night for his army to rest, then struck camp and advanced to Gergovia. In the middle of their march, the cavalry came from Fabius to report a perilous state of affairs. They explained that the camp had been besieged by a huge force. Fresh troops were constantly replacing the enemy soldiers when they grew weary. By forcing them to struggle without rest, this enemy was exhausting our men, for the size of the camp necessitated the same troops manning the rampart continually. Many had been wounded by a hail of arrows and missiles of all kinds. Our artillery machines had proved extremely useful in withstanding these attacks. Now the enemy had withdrawn. Fabius was keeping 2 gates and blocking up all the others, and was setting up barriers on the rampart to make ready for a similar happening the next day. On hearing this news, with the enthusiastic support of all the soldiers, Caesar reached the camp before sunrise. While these events were taking place near Gergovia, the Aedui received the first messengers from Litaviccus. They gave themselves no time to confirm his story. Some acted out of greed, others from motives of rancor or hasty imprudence, which are particularly characteristic of that people, and treated an unsubstantiated report as proven fact. They seized the property of the Roman citizens and started to massacre and enslave them. Their situation was tottering already, but Convicta Latavis sent it tumbling headlong, whipping the ordinary people into a passion so that once their crimes were committed, they would be too afraid to come to their senses. By offering him a safe conduct, they persuaded a military tribune traveling to join his legion, one Marcus Aristius, to leave the town of Cabellunum. Cabellunum. They also forced the men who had settled there to trade to do likewise. Suddenly attacking them while they journeyed, the Gauls stripped them of all their baggage. When Aristius and the rest fought back, they hounded them for a day and a night. After many were killed on both sides, they called to arms an even larger force. While this was going on, news came that all their soldiers were in Caesar's power. They ran to Aristius and explained that nothing had taken place was a matter of public policy. They also ordered an inquiry into the stolen property and the confiscated property of Litaviccus and his brothers. Then they sent envoys to Caesar to clear themselves. All these measures they took to recover their own men, but they were besmirched by their crimes, enticed by the profits to be made from stolen goods, while the number of people involved in what had taken place was large. Alarmed by the thought of being punished, they began to enter secret negotiations for war, and sent embassies to sound out the other Gallic states. Although Caesar was aware of this, he still addressed the envoys as kindly as he could. He did not think any the worse of their state because of the ignorant folly of the common people, nor was his goodwill towards the Aedui diminished. In fact, he expected a fairly serious Gallic uprising. To avoid being surrounded by all the Gallic peoples, he decided on a strategy of withdrawal from Gergovia. This was to gather his entire army together, without the departure, which was actually prompted by anxiety about revolt, looking like headlong flight. As he considered these matters, a chance for a successful action seemed to present itself. He had gone to the smaller camp to inspect the works, and noticed that a hill under enemy control, and in previous days scarcely visible for the numbers of men on it, was now unoccupied. Puzzled, he asked some deserters, a large number of whom were flocking to him daily, why this was. They all confirmed what Caesar himself had already learned through scouts, that there was a crest along this ridge of high ground, which was almost level, but narrow and wooded at the point where it gave access on to the farther point of the town. The Gauls, said the deserters, were much afraid for this place, and were now convinced that once the Romans had one hill under control, if another high point were lost, it would be apparent that they were almost encircled and prevented either from escaping or from foraging for food. Vercingetorix had summoned all his men to fortify this crest along the ridge. On learning this, Caesar sent a number of cavalry squadrons to the place around midnight, and ordered them to cause a rather more disruption than usual, as they ranged in every direction. At first light, he commanded a large number of pack horses and mules to be led out of camp and had the coverings which stopped their loads chafing removed. The muleteers were told to put on helmets to look and act like cavalry, and ride around the hill. To maintain this deception, he included a few cavalry, who were to range more widely. He ordered them all to head for the same place by a long route. All these activities were watched from far off in the town, for there was a good view from Gergovia into the camp. But at such long range it was impossible to find out anything for sure. Caesar sent one of his legions to the same high ground as the cavalry, and when it had advanced a short way, he halted it on the lower ground, and kept it concealed in the woods. Gallic suspicion grew, and their whole force transferred to the place to secure it. Caesar saw that the enemy camp was unoccupied, so he had his men cover up their emblems and conceal their standards. Then he took the soldiers from the main camp to the smaller one, in small groups so as not to attract attention from the town. He explained to his legates, to each of whom he had given command of a legion, what he wanted done. In particular, he warned them to keep their soldiers under control, and prevent them from advancing too far in eagerness to fight or in hope of booty. He also set out the disadvantage of their less favorable position, which he said only speed could alter. This was a moment for seizing an opportunity, not fighting a full-scale battle. After this briefing, he gave the signal, and at the same time sent the Aedui by another ascent on the right. In a straight line, the wall of the town would be just over a mile from the level where the ascent began, but for the way it curved from side to side along its length. The more the route was made to wind to effect a gentler ascent, the more the distance of the march increased. About halfway up the hill, the Gauls had constructed a 6-foot wall of large stones, which ran lengthways from the contour line, to slow down our attack. They had left all the ground below this unoccupied, and filled the upper slopes as far as the town wall with camps packed closely together. When the signal was given, our soldiers quickly reached this line of defense, crossed it, and captured 3 enemy camps. In fact, they acted so quickly in seizing them that Tudimatus, the king of the Nidiobrigus, was taken by surprise in his tent whilst enjoying an afternoon nap, and just managed to tear himself from the hands of the plundering soldiers and escape half naked on a wounded horse. Caesar had achieved what he intended. He ordered the retreat to be sounded. The 10th Legion, which he was accompanying, halted at once. The soldiers of the other legions did not hear the trumpet blowing, because a rather wide gully was between them. But they were held in check by the military tribunes and legates as Caesar had ordered. But the men were excited by the hope of quick victory, and the enemy's flight, and the successful outcome of previous battles, and they believed that there was nothing too difficult for their courage to achieve. So they did not abandon their pursuit until they drew close to the wall and gates of the town. At that moment, a shout went up all over Gergovia. Those inside the most distant part of the town were panicked by the sudden uproar, and thought that the Romans were already inside the gates, so they rushed out of the town. The married women began to throw clothing and money from the wall, baring their breasts and leaning forward with outstretched arms. They pleaded with the Romans not to kill them, not to act as they had done at Avaricum, when they did not even spare the lives of the women and the children. It became apparent that a centurion of the 8th Legion, one Lucius Fabius, had declared among his men that he was stirred by the prospect of rewards such as the ones offered at Avaricum. He refused to let anyone else scale the wall before him. He grabbed 3 of his fellow soldiers, got them to hoist him up, and climbed the wall. Then he turned, grasped hold of each of them, and hauled them up to the wall. In the meantime, the Gauls who had assembled in another part of the town to fortify it, as we mentioned above, first of all heard the shouting, then were roused by a flood of reports that the town was captured by the Romans. They sent cavalry on ahead, and then with a great charge sped off in the same direction. Wherever each man arrived first, there he stood beneath the wall and swelled the fighting strength of his compatriots. A large host gathered. Then the married women, who had just now been holding their hands out to the Romans, started to call upon their men, and, in Gallic fashion, to unbind their hair and bring their children forward into view. For the Romans it was an unfair contest, in terms of both ground and numbers. They were tired by their climb and the duration of the fighting, and found it difficult to withstand men who were fresh and unscathed. When Caesar observed that they were fighting in a disadvantageous position, and that the enemy's numbers were growing, he became anxious for his men and sent to his legate Titus Sextius, whom he had left in charge of the smaller camp. He told him to bring his cohorts from the camp quickly, and to station them at the foot of the hill on the enemy's right flank. In this way, if he saw that our men were driven from their position, he would be able to deter the enemy from pursuing them unchallenged. Then he advanced a short distance with the 10th from the place where he had halted and awaited the outcome of the battle. The fighting was now fierce and at close quarters. The enemy relied on their position and numbers, our men on their courage. Suddenly, our men caught sight of the Aedui on our exposed flank, although Caesar had sent them off to the right by another ascent, to draw off the enemy. Their weapons resembled those of the enemy so closely that our men panicked. Even though they could see that the Aedui's right shoulders were bared, this was the agreed sign, which regularly distinguished them. The soldiers believed that this was actually a ruse of the enemies designed to deceive them. At this moment, the centurion Lucius Fabius and the men who had climbed the wall with him were surrounded and killed, then thrown headlong from the wall. Another centurion from the same legion, Marcus Petronius, had tried to break down the gates, but he was overwhelmed by the enemy host and abandoned hope of saving himself. Gravely wounded, he called to his soldiers, who had followed him. "Since I cannot save myself along with you, I shall at least take care to secure your survival. For it was my desire for glory which made me lead you into danger. When I give you your chance, watch out for your own safety." At once he plunged into the midst of the enemy, killing 2, and forcing the rest a little way back from the gate. His men tried to come to his assistance, but he told them, "Your efforts to preserve my life are futile. Already my blood and my strength are draining away, so get away while you can, and make your way back to the legion." In this manner, he soon afterwards fell fighting, and proved the savior of our men. Our men were overwhelmed on every side, and were forced back from their position with a loss of 46 centurions. But the 10th Legion, which had taken up a support position on rather more even ground, slowed down the Gauls' uncontrolled pursuit. The cohorts of the 13th Legion, which had been brought from the smaller camp by the legate Titus Sextius, and had taken up a position on higher ground, once more took over from the 10th. As soon as the legions reached level ground, they halted and turned their standards to face the enemy. From the foot of the hill, Vercingetorix led his men back inside the fortifications. On that day, almost 700 soldiers were lost. Oof. And so now it might be apparent why this siege has also become famous. The second siege of the year 52 BC. Why? Because this is a Roman loss. It's not a big loss. It's not like the entire legion was routed. But because of certain circumstances and the kind of the way his army was spread out, not all of his soldiers received the signal to halt their advance. And some of them, as Caesar says, were enticed by the prospect of victory, of booty, and continued forward. Now, Caesar, before this all happened, Caesar's original plan was to already back off. He's like, there's no reason to stay here. There's a significant Gallic uprising that's threatening the area. We don't have to force ourselves to engage on Gergovia in particular, right? But then he learned from scouts of a hill, a ridge, that was flanking Gergovia, which if he could hold it, he could essentially have the town encircled, and he would be in a very good position for a siege, whereas right now, it wasn't that great. So he seizes on this opportunity, and he is successful. He routs the Gauls from the hill, but when the sound to stop was given, not everyone obeyed, or not. Perhaps they didn't even hear. In the fog of war, the hectic situation they were in, it's easy to imagine that they were so enthralled by the action that was in front of them that they weren't paying heed to what was going on around them. Now, it's also interesting to see that the Gauls in Gergovia were in a similar state of panic, right? The women are screaming, they're baring their breasts, and they're throwing their arms out to the Romans, saying, don't massacre us, don't do it. And the men who are on the other side of the town are hearing rumors like, oh, they're already in the city, the gates are already breached, so they're in a panic, and they're making mistakes. But they decide to just run in, and then wherever they find themselves, that's where they're going to make their stand. So slowly, as the Gauls pour in from other parts of the city and from the other camps, the tide really begins to shift. Because remember, Caesar doesn't want to commit to this. Someone might ask, well, he already has men on the walls, that they're in a good position, why not commit to this? This was not Caesar's objective. He's like, we're not going to try to storm this, because the Gallic army is huge. Remember, it's not like in Avaricum, where Vercingetorix and his army were off in the distance. They're not in Avaricum, right? They're close, but they're not that close. And they can't immediately rush to the aid of Avaricum. In this situation, it's different. The armies are right there. And reinforcements are close. If he commits hard on Gergovia and he loses, he's in trouble. Titus Labienus has gone off with some other legions as well, so he's not with the full strength of his army either. He chooses to basically say, enough is enough. Now, I think you could debate who's at fault here, really. Ultimately, like the commander's in charge of his army, and if the signal either wasn't received or wasn't obeyed, of course, some of this has to go on Caesar. We don't know really if it's all fury and passion of the soldiers going in. But really, this is Caesar's first loss that we're reading about. Like I said, it's not a major loss. It's not a devastating loss. The legions haven't been routed, but the siege of Gergovia is a failure. So let's lead a little bit more. Someone in chat is asking about the last Roman emperor, so I'm assuming I'm not going to scroll up through all this because there was a lot of talk, but there was a comment about the Eastern Romans and the Western Romans. Yeah, so the Eastern Romans never called themselves the Byzantines. They never stopped saying we're not Romans, and so for them, they were a continuation of the empire. This is a debated topic. I'm sorry we're going off track here, but if you're interested in this kind of thing, it's at what point would you say the East stopped being Roman? Well, some people would say in 476. They're their own entity from now on. But then if you go to Justinian and Belisarius, when they recapture Rome, does that mean they're Roman again? And then they stop being Roman when they lose the city again? Is it when Heraclius becomes emperor in the 600s and he changes the lingua franca of the empire to Greek. Is the language, which is that what's making them Roman? There's a lot of kind of different views you can look at this, but from the perspective of the Romans, the Eastern Romans, they never stopped being Roman. So from their perspective, if you went back in time, if you had a time machine, you could go back and say, "Oh, you guys are Byzantines." They look at you and say, "What?" They say, "No, we're the Romans." So that's what they would say on that. I digress. We're here for Gaul, not for the sad Eastern Empire. It's too depressing to talk about. Let's continue. Caesar says, "The following day, Caesar called an assembly and upbraided the soldiers of their imprudence and overeagerness in deciding for themselves where to advance and what action to undertake, and for not halting when the signal for retreat was given. Also because they could not be restrained by the military tribunes and legates. He explained the significance of disadvantageous ground, and what had motivated him at Avaricum, namely, that even though the enemy were caught without their leader or their cavalry, he had given up the chance of certain victory so as to avoid even small losses in action, because of unfair ground. However admirable their courage, which neither the work of fortifying their camp, nor the height of the hill, nor the wall of the town had been able to check, nevertheless they deserved reproach for their lack of discipline, and their presumption in thinking that they knew more about victory and outcomes than their commander did. He was as eager to find level-headedness and restraint in his soldiers as courage and daring." Caesar finished his speech by encouraging the soldiers not to be disturbed because of these events, and not to attribute what had resulted from unfair ground to bravery on the enemy's part. At the end of the assembly, although he was still considering a departure in much the same terms as before, he led the legions out of camp and halted them in battle order on suitable ground. Vercingetorix did come down on to this level ground, but following a successful cavalry skirmish, Caesar led his army back to camp. After doing likewise the following day, Caesar judged that enough had been done to minimize the Gauls' boasting and to improve his own soldiers' morale. So he struck camp and moved out to the Aedui. Not even then did the enemy pursue. On the third day, he reached the river Allier, rebuilt the bridges, and took his army across. On the other side, he was greeted by Apollodorix and Vercingetorix, and learned that Litaviccus had set out with all his cavalry to rouse the Aedui. It was imperative, therefore, that the two of them should reach the Aeduan people first and reaffirm their loyalty. Caesar already had abundant proofs of Aeduan treachery, and he reckoned that the departure of Apollodorix and Vercingetorix was merely speeding up the revolt of that state. Even so, it seemed unwise to detain them, for fear of seeming to insult them or give the impression that he had something to fear. As they set out, he gave a short account of his services to the Aedui. He recalled the subservient position in which he had found them, driven into the towns, deprived of their land, and all their supplies stolen, forced to pay tribute, hostages wrested from them in humiliating circumstances. And he recounted, too, the good fortune and considerable prosperity to which he had brought them, such that they not only regained their previous distinction, but seemed even to have outdone all previous ages in prestige and influence. With this warning, he dismissed the Aedui from his presence. Novia Dunum was an Aeduan town in a favorable location on the banks of the Loire, to which Caesar had conveyed all his Gallic hostages, his corn, his funds, and most of his baggage, and that of his army. He had also sent there a large number of horses brought for this war in Italy and Spain. When Apollodorix and Vercingetorix reached Novio Dunum, they learned of the situation prevailing in their state. Litaviccus had been received by the Aedui at Bibracte, which is their most important town, while their magistrate Convictolitavis and a large part of the Senate had met with him. An official embassy had been sent to Vercingetorix to obtain peace and a friendly alliance. The two of them thought this advantageous position too good to throw away, so they killed the soldiers on guard at Noviodunum and the men who had come there to trade, and shared the money and horses out among themselves. They had the Gallic hostages sent to the magistrate at Bibracte. Judging that they would not be able to hold the town, they set it on fire to prevent the Romans making use of it. All the corn which they could manage at a short notice they carried away by boat, and the rest they ruined by drenching or burning it. Then they began to muster a force from the neighboring territories, stationed guards along the Loire, and displaced their cavalry conspicuously everywhere to cause panic. Their intention was to cut off the Romans from their corn supply, or to starve them out of the province. The fact that the Loire was swollen with meltwater greatly strengthened their hopes, for it seemed altogether impossible to ford the river. When Caesar learned of all this, he decided that if he was going to run the risk of rebuilding the bridges, he had to hurry, so that he could fight an engagement before larger forces gathered at the river. As for changing his plan and marching to the province, he thought that not even fear made it necessary, nor was there only the shame and disgrace of such a course, and the obstacle of the Cevennes, and the problems of the route, to stand in the way. There was also, and most importantly, the fact of his concern for Labienus and the legions he had sent with him, both now cut off. So it was that he completed a long forced marches by day and night to surprise everyone by reaching the Loire. The cavalry found a fording place which was serviceable in an emergency. The men were able to keep their arms and shoulders clear of the water and hold up their weapons. Cavalry were posted to break up the force of the current. On first sighting them, the enemy were thrown into such confusion that Caesar got the army across in safety. In the fields he found a plentiful supply of corn and cattle, and once the army had sufficient stocks of both, he began to march to the land of the Senones. Treachery at last. We knew it was coming. You know it's coming. It happens every single year. But finally, Rome's greatest ally has turned tail and fled to the enemy. Shameful. Shameful, I say. Bibracte, their capital city, right? Their greatest city, they've burned it to the ground to make sure the Romans cannot use it. And they've all gone over to Vercingetorix's court. They've burned the fields. They've taken as much of their crop as they can with them, destroyed the rest. And now Gaul, all of Gaul, minus the Remi, is in a state of uprising. You hate to see it. It's a terrible thing. I think it's a little funny and a little sad that Caesar took the time with these envoys of Porodorix and Vercingetorix to remind them of exactly what I just reminded you guys of how Caesar and Rome had basically found the Aedui in such an abject state of depression all the way back in 58 BC, and they had completely reversed the fortunes of the Aedui. They had gone from nothing, essentially. They'd been completely humiliated to back at the top of the food chain again within just a few years. Really just two. It was really just 58 and 57 BC, which is the conflict with Ariovistus, the Helvetii, and then the Belgae, the Belgae Revolution, which completely turns the tables. Completely turns the tables on the former oppressors of the Aedui. But such things are often forgotten, and yesterday's allies are tomorrow's enemies after all. You hate to see it. You really do. But alas, here we are. Caesar and Labienus are cut off. And now Caesar is marching against the tribe of the Senones. So he is headed to the north. Let us continue. Caesar says, while Caesar was thus occupied, Labienus left the supplementary levy, which had just arrived from Italy to guard the baggage, and set out with 4 legions for Lutetia. This is a town of the Parisii, sited on an island in the river, Seine. When the enemy learned of his coming, a large force from the neighboring states gathered. The supreme command was entrusted to an Alercan, Camulogenus. Despite his relatively advanced age, he was singled out for this distinction because of his outstanding knowledge of military matters. When he observed a continuous expanse of marsh which flowed into the Seine and formed a significant obstruction over the whole area, he camped there and made ready to prevent our men from crossing. Labienus's first move was to fetch the movable shelters, and to cover the surface of the marsh with wicker hurdles and rubble. Once he saw that this was too difficult, he moved silently out of camp during the 3rd watch, and reached Mediacetum on the same route by which he had come. Mediacetum is a town of the Senones on an island in the Seine. Like Lutetia, which we mentioned just now, he seized about 50 ships and quickly joined them together into a bridge. Then he sent his soldiers across on it. Most of the townspeople had been called up for the war. They were so panic-stricken by this unprecedented action that Labienus won control of the town without a struggle. He repaired the bridge, which the enemy had earlier broken up, then took his army across and began to march downstream towards Lutetia. When refugees from Mediacetum told the enemy what had happened, the Gauls gave orders for Lutetia to be burned and its bridges broken up. They advanced from the marsh to the banks of the Seine and took up a position opposite Lutetia, facing Labienus's camp. By now, news had come of Caesar's departure from Gergovia, and rumors of the Aedui's treachery and the success of the Gallic uprising were reported. The Gauls began to declare to one another at their meetings that Caesar's march and his way over the Loire had been blocked off, and that he had been forced to make for the province. But when the news of the Aedui's treachery broke, the Bellovaci, who were already disloyal themselves, began to muster a force and openly make ready for war. Because of this total change of circumstances, Labienus realized that he must adopt a very different strategy from the one he had intended. He must think no longer of ways to make acquisitions or inflict injury on the enemy in battle, but rather of how to bring his army safely back into Agadincum. On one side threatened the Bellovaci, a nation with a reputation for outstanding bravery in Gaul. Camulogenus held the other, with an army drawn up at the ready. A great river cut the legions off from their baggage and its guards. In the face of these extreme difficulties, Labienus saw that they must look to courage to help them. At dusk, he called a council and urged his men to carry out his orders promptly and to the letter. He assigned each of the ships which he had taken from Mediacetum to a Roman knight, and ordered them to advance 4 miles downstream in silence, starting at the end of the first watch, and await him there. To guard the camp, he left the 5 cohorts which he had thought were the least determined fighters. The remaining 5 from the same legion he ordered to set out upstream at midnight with all their baggage, and to make a great uproar about it. He acquired some small boats and sent them to row upstream too, amid much loud splashing. Soon afterwards, he himself set out in silence with 3 legions, and made for the location where he had told the ships to put in. At the same time when he arrived, a fierce storm had suddenly arisen, so that the enemy scouts who were posted all along the river were caught unawares by our men. Under the control of the Roman knights who had charge of this task, the army and the cavalry were swiftly got across. At almost the same moment, just before dawn, the enemy were told that there was an unusual uproar in the Roman camp, and a large column was marching upstream. The sound of oars could be heard coming from the same direction, and a short way downstream soldiers were being ferried across in boats. On hearing all this, the enemy thought the legions were crossing the river in 3 places, and getting ready to escape because they were so disturbed by the treachery of the Aedui. So they divided their force into 3. They left a garrison opposite the camp and sent a small force towards Mediacetum to advance as far as the ships had done, then led the remainder of their troops against Labienus. By first light, all our men had crossed and the enemy battle line was in view. Labienus urged the soldiers to be mindful of their former courage and their previous successful engagements, and to imagine that Caesar himself, under whose leadership they had so often overcome their foes, was actually present. Then he gave the signal for battle. At the first clash on the right wing, where the 7th Legion was positioned, the enemy was driven back and routed. On the left, the position held by the 12th Legion, the enemy's leading ranks were pierced by weapons and fell, but the survivors still fought fiercely, and no one gave any sign of intending to run away. The enemy leader, Camulogenus, was present among his men, urging them on. Even now the outcome was in doubt, but when the tribunes of the 7th received a report of what was happening on the left wing, they brought the legion around behind the enemy and attacked. Not even then did anyone desert. They were all surrounded and killed. Camulogenus suffered a similar fate. When the troops who had been left facing Labienus's camp to watch it heard the battle underway, they went to the assistance of their comrades and occupied a hill. They were, however, unable to withstand the onslaught of our victorious soldiers. They intermingled with their compatriots in flight, and all who failed to reach the protection of the woods and mountains were put to death by the cavalry. Labienus had made an end of the business. He now returned to Agedincum, where the whole army's baggage had been left. On the 3rd day, he set out from the city with his entire force and made his way to Caesar. The news of the Aedui's defection extended hostilities. Embassies were sent out in every direction, and they did all they could through favors, influence, and bribery to win support of all the Gallic peoples. They seized the hostages Caesar had left in their charge. By threatening to punish these hostages, they terrified waverers into compliance. The Aedui asked Vercingetorix to come to them and explain his campaign strategies, but when this was agreed, they argued that he should hand supreme command to them. Now that the matter was in dispute, an assembly of the whole of Gaul was announced, to be held at Bibracte. The Gauls flocked there in hordes, from every quarter. When the question was put to popular vote, the result was that Vercingetorix was unanimously approved as sole commander. Absent from this assembly were the Remi, Lingonus, and Treveri. The first 2 of these nations still held to their friendship with the Romans, but because the Treveri lived too far away and were presently under German attack, they played no part at all in the campaign and did not support either side. The Aedui took being ousted from supreme control very badly, bewailing their change of fortunes, and began to miss the favor Caesar had showed them. Nevertheless, they did not dare part company with the rest of the Gauls now that the campaign had started. With reluctance, the 2 young men of ambition, Eporedorix and Vercingetorix, bowed to Vercingetorix. Oof. And you know what? I don't feel bad at all. I don't feel bad at all for these Aedui. They betray the Romans, their old allies. They go to Vercingetorix, and then they challenge Vercingetorix. They say, okay, you don't need to be in charge anymore. We're going to be in charge. We're actually the Aedui. We're the most powerful ones here. And the rest of the Gauls look at him like, no, you're not anymore. You don't have the Romans at your back anymore. You're just one of us now. So you fall in line with Vercingetorix. And they gotta suck it up. Some of them are like, oh man, maybe we made a mistake. That's like, oh yeah, you did. You did. But it's too late now. It's too late now. Should have thought of that beforehand. And here they are. Now they're playing second fiddle. And now they're playing it to the other Gauls. The same ones who had betrayed and enslaved them not too long ago. Oof. Gauls, everybody. Truly, a terrible race. Anyway, I just had to say that. I was just so happy. I always smile when I read that part of the book. It's always nice when traitors get what they deserve. And this is just one of those moments, you know? It's a fantastic moment. All right. Let us continue. Caesar says, Vercingetorix demanded that the other states surrender hostages and named the day for this to be effected. He ordered all the cavalry, 15,000 in total, to assemble with haste. He also stated that he would be content with the infantry force he had before. After all, he was not going to try his luck, or fight in a pitched battle, since he had cavalry in plenty. It would be easy to cut the Romans off from both regular corn supplies and forage. But the Gauls must agree to destroy their own stocks of corn and to set their buildings on fire. They must understand that the loss of their property would enable them to achieve perpetual supremacy and liberty. Once these matters were arranged, he demanded 10,000 soldiers from the Aedui and Segusiavi, who live alongside the province, and in addition, 800 cavalry. In charge of them, he put Eporedorix's brother, and told him to attack the Allobroges. In another direction, he sent the Gabali and the nearest Arvernian communities against the Helvi, and also sent the Ruteni and Kadurki to ravage the territory of the Volcae Erakomiki. Despite this, in the hope that their minds were still unsettled after the recent war, he sent messengers and embassies in secret to persuade the Allobroges to join him. To their leaders he promised money, and to the state as a whole, supreme command over the whole of the province. In preparation for all these contingencies, a defense force of 22 cohorts, mustered in the province itself by the legate Lucius Caesar, had been provided. These cohorts were posted throughout the area, acting on their own initiative. The Helvi joined the battle with their neighbors, but were routed. After the death of their leader of their state, one Gaius Valerius Donataris, son of Caburus, together with a number of other men, they were forced back behind the walls of their towns. The Allobroges stationed garrisons at frequent intervals along the Rhone, and kept a close and careful watch on their borders. Caesar was aware that the enemy was the stronger in cavalry, and that because all routes were cut off, there was no hope of reinforcements from Italy and the province. For this reason, he sent across the Rhine into Germany, to the peoples which he had subdued in previous years, and demanded from them cavalry and light-armed troops to fight in amongst the horses. When they arrived, the horses they were using were hardly suitable. So Caesar took the horses of his military tribunes and the rest of the Roman knights and veterans, and distributed them among the Germans. While all this was taking place, the enemy force from the Arverni and the cavalry which had been requisitioned from the whole of Gaul were gathering. Caesar was marching to the Sequani, over the outer limits of the Lingones' territory, so that he could more easily bring help to the province. At the same time, once Vercingetorix had mustered a large host of these contingents, he marched for 3 days and then halted about 9 miles away from the Romans, arranging his force in 3 camps. He summoned his cavalry commanders to a meeting and explained that the moment for victory had arrived. The fact that the Romans were running away to the province and leaving Gaul, he went on, was enough to win them temporary liberty, but it was insufficient to secure peace and tranquility permanently. the Romans would surely gather a larger force and return to prolong the war indefinitely. For this reason, they must attack while the Romans were marching in column and hence encumbered by baggage. If the soldiers went to help their comrades and were delayed for that purpose, they could not continue the march. If, on the other hand, the Roman soldiers abandoned their baggage and thought only of their own safety, and he was sure this was the more likely response, they would at the stroke be stripped of their essential equipment and of their dignity. He went on to assure his cavalry commanders that they could be sure not one of the enemy horsemen would dare to advance even a short distance away from the main column. To encourage them to act bravely, he would parade his entire force in front of the camp and strike fear into the enemy. The cavalry cried that they must be bound by a solemn oath. No man was to be received beneath a roof or have access to his children, his parents, or his wife unless he had twice ridden through the enemy column. This action was approved, and everyone took the oath. The next day, the cavalry was divided into 3 contingents. 2 adopted a battle formation and appeared on either side of the column, while the third began to impede the march from the front. On hearing the news of this, Caesar ordered his own cavalry to divide into 3 likewise, and to attack the enemy. There was fighting everywhere at once. The column halted, and the legions withdrew the baggage into their midst. If it appeared that our men were in difficulties or hard-pressed in any area, Caesar gave orders for the standards to advance and the line of battle to form up. This action slowed the enemy pursuit, as well as encouraging our men with the hope of assistance. After some time, the Germans on the right flank seized a ridge of high ground, forcing the enemy down. They routed them, pursued them right down to the river, where Vercingetorix and his infantry had taken up position, and killed a number of them. After observing this, the rest were afraid of being surrounded, and so fled. There was slaughter everywhere. 3 aristocratic Aeduans were captured and taken to Caesar. The cavalry commander Cottus, who had been locked in rivalry with Convicta Latavus at the previous elections, Cavarillus, who had been put in charge of the infantry after the desertion of Lidovicus, and Eporidorix himself, under whose leadership the Aedui had campaigned against the Sequani before the coming of Caesar. Now all his cavalry had fled. Vercingetorix withdrew his infantry force, which he had stationed in front of the 3 camps, and immediately began the march to Alesia, which is a town of the Mandubi. He issued orders for the baggage to be fetched, and quickly from the camps, and to follow on behind. Caesar had his army's baggage taken to the nearest high ground and left 2 legions behind to guard it. He pursued Vercingetorix as long as the light lasted, and killed about 3,000 of the enemy rear guard. The following day, he pitched camp near Alesia. He reconnoitered the city's position and provoked panic in the enemy. Then, after encouraging the soldiers for the task they faced, he set about the work of circumvallation. And so we arrive. The humiliation of Gergovia has been avenged. And now, the siege of Alesia, the greatest siege of antiquity, perhaps, begins. The 2 walls! That siege. That's where we're going next. But we'll have to wait for that until next week. That's what we're going to be doing for next week's history stream. I want to talk a little bit about the situation that Caesar has found himself in multiple times. We have to remember that Caesar's always outnumbered, right? The Romans are completely outnumbered in this whole war. And somehow, some way, Caesar still manages to come out on top. And he's even gone so far as to actually get German auxiliaries. Can you imagine? The people who will become Rome's greatest enemy, Germania, the Germans themselves, serving the Roman cause, fighting side by side with the legions against the treacherous Gauls. Oh, God. I hate them so much. I think this victory, despite kind of not being mentioned a lot in the history books, because everybody focuses on Alesia, but this cavalry encounter was actually probably the biggest W that the Romans needed, because they're still coming off of Gergovia, which, despite not being the worst L, was still an L. And for Vercingetorix, this was a chance to really end the war. He's got a huge cavalry advantage. He splits them up into 3, right? He's like, we can hem them down. We can do almost a strategy like Ambiorix did when he ambushed Sabinus and Cottus's legions. Excuse me, Sabinus and Cotta's legions. But it backfired. Caesar was no Sabinus. He's no Cotta. And he was able to provide assistance wherever it was needed, wherever his men were being pressured. And his own cavalry, as well as the Germanic cavalry, ended up routing the Gallic cavalry. And, you know, he mentioned it. Caesar mentioned this in the previous year, in the year 53, in the previous chapter. And Caesar talks about how the situation between the Gauls and the Germans, because Caesar, he writes a lot about this. And he talks about the relationship between the Gauls and the Germans and how it used to favor the Gauls, right? The Gauls would go across the Rhine and really be on the offensive against the German threats. But that dynamic slowly tilted, and then the Germans themselves find themselves in taking the initiative, and they're crossing the Rhine to the west. And they're attacking Gallic lands, and they're, you know, intermingling with the Gallic peoples and taking tribute and things like that. And so the Gauls now have a proper fear of the Germans. And that cavalry is coming in super clutch, and that will continue coming in clutch as we get into Alesia. But that is for next week's stream. So we'll stop it there. Thank you everyone so much for joining me today. If you've stayed this far and you're watching the YouTube video, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I think it's far more fun to read the full text and kind of do the deep dive, not just the surface level scrapes that a lot of the shorter videos will get you. I'll be doing some of those too, because those are still fun. Thank you again. I hope you all had a happy new year. As of recording this, today's stream was January the 3rd. It was actually kind of a scary new year for me, because there was a huge earthquake here in Japan. So that was a time, but we're okay. No problem. If you want to join us, like I said, you can also watch this live. We do this live on Wednesdays. We'll be continuing, I think. If there's enough support, we can actually do the Civil War as well after we're done with the Gallic War. And we can talk a little bit more about the rest of Caesar's life, because it's a fantastic life to read about and study. Until then, thank you guys so much for watching today. Have a great rest of your days, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.